We'll continue with 9C, items excluded from sale. All the brackets on the wall, floor, ceilings are considered to be not part of the purchase price. In fact, most of the time the buyer would not want these brackets, and they should be removed, as well as the furniture on the property. However, if there is a furniture that is secured to the building for protection due to earthquake, they are not considered part of the fixture because it is being attached to the building for earthquake reasons or earthquake or safety purposes. The seller is only required to patch up the holes but are not required to do the painting. Number 10, allocation of costs. It talks about the fact that the seller may agree to provide certain inspections or reports or certificates, does not necessarily obligate the seller to make the repairs unless there's a separate agreement entered into between the buyer and the seller to make the repairs. 10B is about corrective or remedial actions. Certain things are legally required. They have to be installed, such as the smoke detector, carbon monoxide, and the water heater bracing. It must be completed according to law. However, the buyer and the seller can negotiate between themselves who's going to pay for these costs. The seller is the one who's going to have to sign the statement of compliance, even if the buyer pays for them. Now, point of sale requirements. Earlier I mentioned that point of sale are just local ordinances that require inspections to be performed on transactions that will change title, including sale of the property, such as the City of El Monte. Sometimes in the point of sale ordinance, the city may allow repair work to be completed after close of escrow. So in such a case, typically the buyer would have to post a bond to make sure that the buyer will do the work after the escrow closes. If for whatever reason there is re-inspection fee because the city has to come back and check something else, to check something, that re-inspection fee is usually paid by the seller. However, if the buyer incurs costs to comply with this re-inspection fee because their lender requires it, then the seller would have to reimburse the buyer for the re-inspection fee. Now let's talk about home warranty next. Earlier I mentioned that a buyer may waive home warranty but may still purchase a home warranty plan at the buyer's expense should the buyer changes their mind. Number 11, A is about the TDS, NHD, and other statutory and supplemental disclosures. If for whatever reason there is new information that is discovered during an escrow, then this paragraph requires that the seller provide supplemental disclosures to the buyer unless the information was obvious to the buyer, was something the buyer already knew. If it was something the buyer otherwise was aware of, then there's no need to provide supplemental disclosures. Let disclosures if the building was built before 1978. Home fire hardening disclosure and advisory, that is a new form that is required to be completed if the property is located in a high or very high fire severity zone. You have to refer to the NHD for that. Now, typically, our TCs have been trained to check the NHD for high or very high fire severity zone so that they would go ahead and prepare the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure to assist the seller to fulfill this legal requirements. And buyer cannot waive all these legally required disclosures. 10E talks about that. 10F requires that the buyer returns all the signed copies of the disclosure. In fact, the seller could actually cancel this agreement after giving a notice to buyer to perform if the buyer refuses to return the signed disclosures. Termination rights, as with any statutory disclosure, typically the buyer would have 3 days if the disclosures have been delivered personally, or 5 days is by email by mail, which is the same thing as email, which is the same thing as by mail. If the buyer is not happy with the information that was provided, maybe there's something about the property that was disclosed that concerned the buyer, at which point the buyer may decide to cancel, but the buyer has to do so within 3 days if the disclosures have been given to the buyer in person, and have to do so within 5 days if it was given to him by email. H, withholding taxes. This one is talking about the withholding will depend on the FIRPTA disclosure. So the seller's obligation is to complete the FIRPTA disclosure, and then based on the FIRPTA disclosure, the escrow officer will decide if withholding is necessary or not. Megan's Law is about sex offenders. That's a disclosure talking about whether or not there's a sex offender in the neighborhood, and also advises the buyer that the buyer can go to a website and get the information, meganslaw.ca.gov. Notice regarding gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines, that's just a standard disclosure about gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. Now, K, on the condominium plan unit development disclosure, typically the disclosures will come by way of the HOA docs. The HOA docs will contain any litigation, anything that is important to the buyer about the HOA association. Natural and environmental hazards. This is actually about a booklet that the buyer is entitled to receive. In fact, it says here, the seller shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3 and 1 above, if required by law, to deliver to buyer the earthquake guide and environmental hazards booklet. This is a booklet that can be found in EPUB. If you're familiar with EPUB, if there's any standard booklet that has to be provided to the buyer, you can get it in PDF format from the zip form in the EPUB library. M, known material facts. This is a paragraph that says seller has an obligation to disclose known material facts or defects affecting the property to the buyer. Number 12, buyer's investigation of property and matters affecting property. The buyer has the right to inspect the property, and that would include termite inspection, home inspection. It would include all other investigations, such as insurance that we talked about. So I mentioned that if a buyer failed to investigate the insurance requirement, and it turns out that it's a property for which the buyer could not procure an insurance. Now, in such a case, the buyer has a loan, the lender may refuse to approve the loan. Now, if the buyer had removed all contingencies, and then something like this happens, the buyer cannot use the failure to discover the insurance requirements, resulting in the loan not getting approved as a reason for the cancellation. If the buyer wants to go onto the property and do some destructive testing, such as taking soil samples or drilling holes on the wall, the buyer needs the seller's consent and permission. If the buyer has to do any work on the property and hires some individuals, laborers or contractors, to do whatever work that the buyer wanted to do, although it is not very common, the buyer has to indemnify the seller in case the buyer doesn't make the payment to the people that they hire, and the seller had a lien on his property. The buyer has to protect the seller against such liens. Now, this paragraph here also talks about the use of the notice of non-responsibility as a way for the seller to prevent liens from being recorded against the property. The seller is not obligated to remove any personal properties to facilitate the buyer's inspection. So no moving of personal property is required. Title investing, number 13. The buyer will receive a copy of the preliminary title report and has to approve it within a certain period of time. And if there is something that is required by the escrow holder of the seller in order to clear title, the seller has an obligation to respond within 7 days. Any such request from the escrow must be responded to by the seller within 7 days. Here's the important one, and that's pretty new. It wasn't in the old RPA before. That's number 13E. So if the buyer is a legal entity, in other words, not a natural person, and the purchase price is at least $300,000, which in California most of the time it is, and the purchase price is made without a bank loan, it's an all-cash purchase, then the buyer has to complete a form known as the GTO, Geographic Targeting Order, issued by FinCEN. Purpose of that is for FinCEN to acquire information about a particular buyer. If you're not familiar with FinCEN, FinCEN is a governmental agency that was formed after 9/11. And obviously this law was formed to prevent money laundering. So if a buyer refuses to cooperate with the title company, the buyer could lose this contract because the seller may cancel this agreement if the buyer refuses to cooperate and title insurance company would not issue title insurance. Item G, this is actually a new one. It used to be that the standard RPA would allow the seller to provide just the standard CLTA, but they changed it. Now the seller is required to provide ALTA/CLTA policy as long as the title insurance company does provide such an insurance. So it's actually more expensive for the seller. However, if the title insurance company does not offer ALTA/CLTA, then the seller is only required to provide a CLTA policy. Now let's talk about the time periods for removal of contingencies and the cancellation rights. Typically, the buyer would have 17 days for the inspection contingency as well as any other types of contingencies. Regarding the inspection contingencies, in order for the buyer to exercise the buyer's right for inspection contingency, one of the things that the seller has to do is to deliver the documents that are required by the contract, such as reports, disclosures, and information for which the seller is responsible. So after receipt of the information, upon completion of the buyer's investigations, then the buyer have to decide if the buyer wants to move forward and close the deal. The buyer must remove the contingency on or before the date of contractual removal date. However, there is one exception. That exception being if the seller failed to deliver all the required documents. See, one of the things that the seller have to be careful about is the seller and the listing agent might be thinking, for example, the inspection contingency is 17 days. But if there's even one little item, such as a HOA documents that's delayed, then as long as the HOA documents is not delivered to the buyer has no obligation to remove the contingency. Now you see why it's important to order the HOA docs early, so that there will be no delay in the buyer's removal of contingencies. Keep that in mind, because the buyer get 5 days, got more time from the day that the buyer receives the last of the documents from the seller. After the last document is delivered, the buyer got 5 extra days to remove inspection contingency. So I suppose if your buyer needs more time, one of the tricks you can use is to find out exactly what documents is missing. And then basically, if you are being asked to remove contingency, you just let the listing agent know that you're still missing this document, and therefore the time has not come to remove the inspection contingency. If no contingency has been removed, and contingency is by active method only, then the contingency will continue, and the buyer should be able to keep their deposit if the buyer cancel based on non-satisfaction of the information that was given, and still get their deposit back. Now let's talk about the seller's right to cancel. Seller basically have several situations, 3 of them. Number 1 is based on the buyer contingencies when the buyer failed to timely remove the buyer's contingencies. Number 2 is based on buyer's failure to fulfill the terms of the contractual obligation, such as failure to wire transfer the good faith deposit. And the third situation might be based on the seller's own contingencies, because if the seller has a replacement property contingency and can't find the replacement property, and the buyer is not willing to give the seller more time, the seller can certainly cancel based on the seller's contingency. So these are the 3 situations. Now let's talk about the buyer's right to cancel. There are basically also three situations. One is based on seller contingencies. If it is time for the seller to remove the seller's contingencies, and if the seller fails to do that, the buyer can in fact cancel this agreement by first giving the seller a notice to seller to perform. And another situation might be the seller's failure to perform the seller's contractual obligations, such as delivery of reports or disclosure to the buyer. That situation, of course, will be based on the buyer's own contingencies. Now, if either the buyer or the seller fail to perform as required by the contract, then either side, the party that who did not receive the performance, may send a notice to perform to the other side, and that notice is typically at least 2 days after delivery. In other words, the buyer or the seller cannot use a shorter time but can use longer than 2 days. Minimum of 2 days notice must be given. It's not 2 business days, it's 2 days. That means 2 calendar days. Effect of removal of contingencies. So either the buyer, now if the buyer removes the contingencies, the seller has no right to cancel unless the seller himself has a contingency and has not removed it. Removal of seller contingency means that the seller has no conditions to cancel the contract. Effect of cancellation on deposits. Now, if one side or the other decides to cancel, and if the cancellation is proper, then both sides must agree to sign joint escrow instruction to release the deposit to the buyer. If one side in bad faith fails to sign the escrow instruction for the release, then there's penalty. Repairs should be completed. Now, if the buyer and the seller negotiated for the seller to make certain repairs and the seller signed an agreement to make that repairs, all those repairs would be completed before the final inspection, the final walkthrough, or final verification of the property.